Alright, so in this activity what we're going to learn how to do is to calibrate the nail soil moisture reading. And we're going to learn how to use a map function, and we're also going to use a series of if-then statements to be able to tell whether we need to water our plant or not. So to do this, we're going to need the same materials that we needed for the basic soil moisture activity. We're going to need a couple of alligator clips. We're going to need our microbit. It's nice to have a couple of nails, because what the nails allow you to do is when you get your soil is that you can stick the nails down in the soil and it just holds everything in place. So that's what we need, and let's get started with the coding. So with the soil moisture, we're going to need to read a number from a pen. So let's create a variable. I'm going to make this variable and I'm going to call it soil moisture. Okay. And I'm going to set my soil moisture to a value. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to have my red alligator clip here. It's going to be attached to my 3-volt pin. And I'm going to attach my green, which is basically the negative side. I'm going to attach it to P0. Okay. And that's going to matter because I'm going to create a map. And why I'm going to create a map is I'm going to try to put the numbers in a way that might make a little more intuitive sense. You're going to be getting an analog number, which is going to go from 0 to 1023. So, that can be a little hard, particularly for kids to understand. So what I want to do is we're going to map this, say, from 0 to 100, where lower numbers mean dry, higher numbers mean wet. So I am going to go down to my pins number, or my pins block, and I've got this big oval block here that says map. Okay, so I'm going to drag this over to my programming space, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this map and I am going to pop it up into my soil moisture and map. And notice it says 0, so I need to know what to map. Okay, so what I'm going to map is I'm going to map the reading that is coming in from pin 0, and this is an analog reading. So I go back to my pins block and I'm going to choose analog read pin. Okay, so that's the data that I'm getting in. That is going to go from a low of 0 to a high of 1023. And I'm going to map it from a low of 0 to a high of 100. Okay, so what it's doing is it's taking that 1023 number and it's mapping it onto 0 to 100. That's going to make it a little bit easier for us to interpret whether my soil is dry or whether it's not dry. Okay, and then I'm going to want to show that number on my microbit. So now I've got my number showing on my microbit. And if we want to make sure that we only do get 2 digits, remember you can go to your math block and you can round that number. Okay, because we don't want lots of decimal points scrolling across our little screen on the microbit, just because it takes a long time for things to scroll. Okay, so now I've got a reading. Now I need to do something with that reading. So I'm going to create a series of if statements. There's lots of different ways to do this, and oftentimes the first time when youth are introduced to the idea of if statements, and particularly a series of if statements, sometimes it's easiest just to do things in a series of if statements instead of if, else, else, else statements. So let's go into our logic statement. We're going to need this if true block. Okay, now we're going to need to have some comparisons. Alright, so we need to compare against a couple of things. So I'm going to make a couple more variables here. I'm going to make a variable and say dry. And I'm going to make a variable and I'm going to say wet. Oops. Alright, wet. Okay. So now I want to set these 2 variable conditions to certain numbers. So I'm going to drag this off, and in my onStart block, I'm going to say I'm going to set wet if it's going to be greater than 70. And what we'll have to do is play around with putting water in. And when the soil looks wet, we can change that number based on the reading. Again, we're going to calibrate it. And I'm going to do exactly the same thing for my dry. Okay, so I'm going to set my dry reading to 30. Okay, and make sure I do my draw down menu, change the variable. So if my soil number gets 70, it's going to be wet. If it's 30, it's going to be dry. So now what I want to do is in my if statement. Now I want to have three conditions here. I want to say if it's too dry, give me an indication. If it's too wet, give me an indication. If it's in between wet and dry, also give me an indication and let me know that things are okay. So let's do that first condition first, because it's the most complicated one. So we're going to go to our logic statement. Alright, I've got this if true, that's already here. But what I want to do is I'm going to want to do a boolean statement. You know, this I'm going to have two operators in here. Because what I want to know is if my soil moisture is greater than dry and it's less than wet. Alright, so I want it in between those two things. Then show me something like a smiley face. So that's where that boolean operator comes in. Now also under my logic block, I'm going to come down here, I'm going to drag my other little hexagon there. Oops. And you have to get them in the right spots. And that little red dot has to connect up. Okay. And we're going to have two of these. Okay. Because what I want to know is if my soil moisture is if it's greater than dry and if my soil moisture is less than wet. Okay, so this is my happy spot. Alright, I want you to show on the screen, you know, a heart or a smiley face or something that says, hey, things are good. Okay, now let's look at the other condition. So I'm going to drag another if statement down here. Okay, I'm going to put it outside that first one. This one is easier. So now if this condition here isn't true, nothing's going to happen. Okay. Now I'm going to jump to my next one. So the program just runs through. So now I'm going to say, hey, now if my soil moisture, so I need a comparison block again. If my soil moisture is less than my variable dry, alright, that means I want to show that, hey, I'm really dry, something's wrong. So I'm going to do a little show icon down here, and I'm going to say a frowny face, or maybe let's go with the skull, because your plants are going to die. Okay, now we've got one more condition to go with. Right, so I'm going to do a cut and paste. So I just pasted in my dry if-then statement or if statement. So now if my soil moisture is greater than my wet condition, okay, I want you to show me a frowny face. Okay, because the plants also aren't happy if they're standing water, because then the roots can't breathe, and so the roots suffocate, so they die. So now I've got this. I'm going to zoom out so we can see our whole program, and zoom up. All right. So I've got my on start. That's where I define my kind of global variables of wet and dry. And then in my forever loop, I'm setting my soil moisture, and I'm mapping that from the reading it's getting on the microbit to 0 to 100. And that way I can create a gradation on low to high as dry to wet. Alright, I show that number on my screen, and then I test some conditions here on whether things are good or bad, and then give me an indicator. Okay. And so then, as always, the next step we have to do is download that to our microbit. Okay. And so I've already downloaded a version of this same code to my microbit. And I stick my nails in, and I'm going to be getting a reading. So right now my reading is 54, so it's not too bad. Alright, so 57. Right? And so again, you can move these guys around and then add in water until you begin to figure out, hey, you know, what constitutes dry, what constitutes wet here. Okay? And once you get the numbers right, then you have an indicator saying, hey, maybe you should add some water, or you need to set me out in the sun, so let me evaporate some water so I'm not too wet.